The air trembled before the dawn, not from wind, but from the heartbeat of metal. It started low, a slow mechanical growl that crawled across the valley, rising like thunder from the earth itself. The ground shook. Birds scattered into the mist, their wings slicing through the smoke that hadn't yet lifted from last night's rain. And through that pale haze came the silhouette of a tank, its turret turned with a slow, deliberate grace, a gesture that felt almost alive. The morning light caught the edges of its armor, gleaming gold for a fleeting second before the dust swallowed it whole again. Steel, forged, welded, and beaten into obedience, had become something more than just a machine. To those who watched it move, it looked like a living thing, a beast made of iron and fire. Inside, the men breathed in rhythm with it. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Each vibration underfoot told them everything they needed to know. The mood of their machine, its hunger, its pain. To outsiders, it was just a weapon. But to them, it was a partner. A creature they had built trust with, through chaos, through fear, through the kind of silence that only exists before a storm. Every bolt, every weld, every oil-stained panel carried the memory of hands that had touched it, hands that might not be here tomorrow. The gunner's eyes stayed fixed. Through the periscope slit, his vision narrowed to a world framed in cold steel. The driver, half blinded by smoke and sweat, gripped the controls with a kind of reverence. And the commander, the one who sat just below the hatch, kept his hand on the turret wall, feeling every tremor like a pulse beneath his skin. They called it the beast, but somewhere deep down, they knew the truth. It was them. Their fear, their courage, their violence, all fused into one terrible, beautiful symphony. Outside, the field stretched endless, a sea of mud and broken metal where yesterday's battles had been fought and forgotten. Charred wheels, torn helmets, the ghosts of yesterday's engines lay buried beneath layers of ash. The tank rolled over them like time itself, heavy, relentless, indifferent. There was something almost sacred in the way the machine moved. The squeal of its treads was like the bow of a violin drawn across rusted strings. The engine roared in steady rhythm, a heartbeat forged in diesel and fury. Together they made music, a song that only soldiers could understand. The song of steel. No one spoke of it, but they all felt it. The strange calm that came when the machine came alive. Out here, where every breath could be the last, the tank was their sanctuary. The thick walls insulated them from the screaming world outside, but also trapped them within a cage of echoes and heat. Inside that iron shell, time behaved differently. Seconds stretched like hours. Minutes vanished without warning. Every jolt, every metallic clang, was a reminder that death was always just one shell away, close enough to hear, close enough to smell. The gunner hummed quietly under his breath. A habit, perhaps, to keep the mind from drifting. The loader checked his shell, hands moving automatically, though his fingers trembled slightly. The driver whispered something to the machine like a prayer, and the commander closed his eyes for a moment, hearing the world through the steel around him. Above them, the wind howled through the narrow hatch, carrying faint traces of smoke and gunpowder. It wasn't war yet, not today. But the air already knew what was coming. Somewhere, far ahead, artillery thunder rolled like distant drums. The machine shifted gears. The noise deepened. Mud splashed against the sides as it began to move forward again. Each motion felt deliberate, as though the tank itself knew the path it was taking, as though it had chosen it long before the men inside ever climbed aboard. There's something poetic about machines like this, built by human hands, yet somehow surpassing their makers in endurance. Men break, flesh burns, but steel survives. It carries the marks of its battles like a veteran's scars, never healing, never forgotten. Every dent tells a story. Every scratch whispers a name. The commander glanced down at the controls. Half a dozen levers, gauges flickering weakly, the faint scent of oil filling the narrow cabin. He remembered when they first received her, how the paint still shined, the bolts untouched by blood or rain. Back then, she was just another assignment, another number etched into the side. But after the first battle, something changed. The crew began speaking about her like she was one of them. They gave her a name. They spoke to her. They cursed her. They thanked her. That's what war does. It turns metal into memory, and men into machines. Outside, dawn was breaking wider now. A low sun spilled over the horizon, washing the battlefield in amber and smoke. The light struck the tank's armor, revealing 1,000 imperfections, dents from old engagements, streaks of soot that refused to wash away. It looked wounded, yet unstoppable. Beautiful, in a way that only destruction could be. The commander rose slightly, pushing open the hatch. A rush of cold wind hit his face. The world outside was colorless. Gray mud, gray clouds, gray bones of trees long dead. He squinted into the distance, searching for movement. For a moment, the silence stretched so long it almost felt peaceful. Then, a single sound cut through it. Faint, metallic, unmistakable. The echo of another engine, somewhere beyond the fog. The men froze. The commander's jaw tightened. He didn't need to speak. The crew was already moving, rehearsed and precise. Hands darted across levers. Gears whined. The engine's pitch rose like a warning. In that instant, the calm of the machine turned into tension, a coiled spring of potential violence. The song shifted tempo. No longer a slow hum, but a growing rhythm of chaos and purpose. The commander stared into the haze, heart pounding. Somewhere out there was another beast, another machine like theirs, waiting for its own cue in the orchestra of destruction. And yet, as the tank rolled forward, its steel heart pounding in perfect sync with their own, none of them felt fear. Only focus, the kind that burns all doubt away until all that's left is motion. Because for these men, this was their world now, a world of smoke, noise, and rhythm, where life and death danced on the edge of steel. And as the first echoes of gunfire began to ripple through the valley, their song rose once more, louder, fiercer, unstoppable. The song of steel had begun again. Inside the tank, the world shrank to metal, heat, and breath. Every sound had weight, the clatter of a spent shell, the whine of gears, the sharp tick of the periscope lens as it turned. It was like living inside the chest of a giant, feeling every heartbeat, every muscle twitch, every rumble deep within its ribs. There were 4 of them. 4 souls sealed within a coffin of steel. The commander, Captain Lasker, the oldest, with eyes that never blinked too long. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of years and losses the others didn't dare ask about. His face was half shadow, half memory, carved by dust, sleeplessness, and command. The gunner, Mason, young but steady. His hands were always moving, adjusting, aligning, recalibrating. He treated the main gun like a sacred instrument, whispering to it before every shot as if asking permission to unleash its fury. The driver, Anton, quiet, methodical. His world existed in inches and pressure. He didn't see the battlefield, only felt it through vibrations and resistance. Every bump told him a story, the difference between earth and flesh, between victory and wreckage. And Reeves, the loader, the heartbeat of the crew. Strong, loud, impulsive, he filled the air with jokes, curses, anything to drown out the silence. His laughter often echoed louder than the engine, but behind that noise was a fear he'd never admit to. Fear that if he stopped talking, he might start thinking, and thinking was dangerous here. Together, they were a machine made of men. Each movement depended on the next. One mistake and the rhythm broke. The song fell apart. The tank lurched forward suddenly, throwing them against the walls. Mud splattered across the viewports. The smell of oil and sweat thickened. Anton grunted, tightening his grip on the controls. Outside, something was moving. Faint shadows flickering through the haze. "Hold position," Lasker ordered, his tone flat but sharp enough to slice tension. Mason adjusted the scope, his eye pressed close, breath steady. Reeves loaded another shell, the metallic click echoing like a clock counting down. Inside the beast, seconds stretched into eternities. There was no sky in here, no sunlight. Only dim red bulbs and the faint glow of dials that flickered like dying stars. The air was heavy with oil and heat, thick enough to taste. Every breath carried the scent of smoke, metal, and men who hadn't seen daylight in days. Outside, the world was chaos. Inside, it was control. Fragile, precise, mechanical control. Lasker leaned over Mason's shoulder. Through the narrow slit, a shape emerged, distant, angular, moving against the grain of fog. "Another tank. Enemy. 200 meters," Mason murmured. "Loaded," Reeves confirmed. "Driver, hold steady," Lasker said quietly. And then, silence. The kind that presses against your ears until you can hear your own pulse. The kind that feels alive. The tank's gun roared. A burst of fire, smoke, and recoil slammed through the crew. The sound was not a sound, it was a wave that rattled bone and metal alike. Mason didn't flinch. Reeves already had the next round halfway into the chamber. The process was reflex, mechanical precision born from repetition and fear. Through the slit, a flash, distant explosion, then black smoke curling upward like ink in water. "Hit," Mason whispered. Reeves grinned, wiping soot from his forehead. "That's one for the beast," but Lasker didn't smile. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. One tank down meant there were others watching. There were always others. He closed the hatch above him, muting the sound of the outside world. Inside, the echo of their victory faded quickly, swallowed by the steady growl of the engine. The tank moved again, grinding over debris, the rhythm of war resuming like a pulse that refused to stop. After a while, Reeves broke the quiet. "You ever think about how they look at us out there?" he asked. Mason frowned, still focused on the scope. "Who? The infantry. The guys walking behind us. I bet to them we look invincible." Anton snorted softly. "Invincible doesn't sweat like this." Reeves chuckled. "Still, I like that they think it. Makes the fear easier to carry." Lasker didn't respond. He just adjusted the radio dial, catching fragments of distant chatter. Voices of other crews, other battles unfolding beyond the ridge. The world outside was burning, and they were the fire's instruments. A sudden metallic clang, sharp, deafening. The tank shuddered violently. "Hit!" Anton yelled. But no penetration, not just a glancing strike, armor holding strong. The smell of burning paint filled the air. Reeves cursed under his breath. Mason steadied his scope again. "Return fire," Lasker ordered calmly. Boom! Another shell left the barrel. Another explosion bloomed in the fog. The dance of destruction continued. A pattern they knew too well. Action, reaction, reload, fire, repeat. Until one side stopped moving. But between each command, each shot, there was something else. The silence between heartbeats. The space where doubt lived. Mason's hands trembled for a fraction of a second as he lined up another shot. In that moment, he remembered faces, the ones that never came back from missions like this. The laughter that used to echo through the barracks. The smell of home-cooked bread that he could almost taste if he closed his eyes long enough. He blinked hard. The memory vanished, swallowed by smoke. "Target locked," he said. Fire. Boom, another impact. Another victory no one would celebrate. By dusk, the engine had quieted. The machine rested at the edge of a ruined field, its armor blackened and breathing heat. The men sat in silence, each lost in a different thought, staring at nothing. Outside, the horizon bled orange. Inside, time stood still. Reeves finally broke the stillness. "You think anyone will remember us?" he asked. Lasker didn't look at him. "No one remembers the men inside," he said. "They remember the machine." That truth lingered heavy in the cramped space, heavier than the smell of oil or smoke. Because deep down, they knew it was true. Out there, people cheered for victories, for flags, for steel. But the names of the ones inside the beast faded like whispers against the wind. Mason looked at the gun, its barrel still warm. "Maybe that's fair," he said quietly. "The machine outlives us anyway." Lasker nodded once. That's what it was made to do. The radio crackled suddenly, distant orders calling them back to formation. The men moved wordlessly, like clockwork. Reeves loaded one last shell, just in case. Anton fired the engine. Mason adjusted his scope. Lasker placed his hand on the steel wall beside him, a gesture half ritual, half respect. "All right, beast," he murmured. "One more day," the tank growled in response as if it heard him. The gears turned, the treads bit into the dirt, and the crew of 4 disappeared once more into the fog, swallowed by the endless machinery of war. Inside the beast. The song continued, a rhythm of steel and sorrow, of men who had forgotten where they ended and the machine began. There are ghosts that do not wear faces, and they live inside the machine. When the engine sleeps, when the metal cools and silence folds over the hull, the ghosts begin to whisper. They speak in echoes of shells, in faint metallic ticks that sound almost like heartbeats. Long before Lasker's crew ever touched her controls, the tank had known others. Hands with different scars, voices speaking other languages, dreams that ended in the same mud. Each dent, each weld seam, each spot where the paint bubbled from heat told a story the men could never read but always felt. Mason once said the tank smelled of memory, an odd phrase, but the others understood. Beneath the oil and grease there lingered something older, smoke baked deep into the metal, the trace of fields they had never seen. When the wind came from the east and carried with it a hint of rain, they swore the machine breathed differently, as if remembering. Lasker treated it like a living thing. Every evening, after the engine was cut, he would walk around the hull, running his palm along the scars. He could tell which marks were from battle, which from transport, which from careless repairs. History, he called them, though he never said whose. Reeves joked that if you peeled away the layers of paint, you'd find names written underneath, names of the dead. Maybe the living, too, anyone who'd left a trace, at night. When the others slept, Anton would sometimes stay by the open hatch and watch the faint glow of the cooling exhaust. It looked like breath in winter air. The machine exhaled slowly, evenly, the same rhythm as a sleeper's chest. It calmed him. Outside, the world was chaos and rumor. Inside this armor, there was order, even if that order was forged from destruction. The old mechanics used to say every tank was born twice, once in the factory and once in fire. The first birth made it metal, the second made it legend. Lasker's machine had earned both. There were old bullet holes that had been sealed with mismatched bolts, patches of steel from other tanks welded over her flanks, trophies of survival that gave her a patchwork skin. To strangers, she looked battered. To the crew, she was sacred. One afternoon, during a lull between engagements, Mason climbed out onto the turret to scrub the soot from her markings. The sun beat down hard and the armor burned his palms, but he didn't stop. "She deserves to shine," he said. Reeves laughed and tossed him a rag, but there was something almost reverent in the way Mason worked, tracing each letter of the serial number like a prayer. Later that day, as they refueled beside the river, Anton caught his reflection in the steel. For a moment, the face looking back wasn't his. It was younger, unfamiliar, yet somehow familiar. Maybe another driver from another war. The machine blurred time, he thought. Inside it, generations bled together. That night thunder rolled far away, and the crew sat in the dim light of a single bulb. Lasker began speaking quietly, almost to himself. "She's seen more of this war than any of us," he said. "You can feel it in the way she moves. Like she knows where not to go." No one answered. They all felt it, the uncanny intuition that sometimes saved them from mines, ambushes, unseen traps. The machine led them as much as they guided it. Reeves broke the silence with his usual grin. "You're talking about her like she's got a soul." Lasker's eyes didn't move. "Maybe she does. Maybe every man we lost left a piece of his soul in her." For a long time, nobody spoke. The only sound was the faint click of cooling armor, a rhythm like distant applause. The next morning, fog hung low across the field. The tank's outline appeared first as a silhouette, a hulking relic half submerged in mist. To anyone else, it would look like a beast lying in wait. To them, it was a monument that happened to move. As they climbed aboard, each man placed a hand on the steel, habit, superstition, respect. When the engine started, the world trembled again. Black smoke unfurled like a banner. The ground beneath them vibrated, and for a brief instant they felt the machine remembering all the places it had been. The noise was not just mechanical, it was ancestral. The roar of countless engines layered over time, a single unending breath of war. Hours later, while they waited for orders, Mason found a scrap of metal lodged behind a vent. It was jagged, small, and oddly warm despite the cold air. When he wiped it clean, faint numbers appeared, part of an old serial code, not their own. Another tank's fragment, fused into theirs after a long-forgotten battle. He held it up to the light and wondered whose armor it once was, whose story had merged with theirs. He slipped the piece into his pocket without a word. The radio crackled again. Voices overlapping, coordinates murmured in haste. The crew readied themselves automatically, every motion rehearsed. Yet as they moved, there was a subtle awareness that none of this was entirely theirs anymore. The machine guided them, steering with unseen hands, carrying the memories of all who had touched its controls. When they rolled out of the camp, the tracks left deep imprints in the mud. Water filled the grooves almost instantly, reflecting the gray sky like liquid steel. Behind them, the prints looked identical to those left weeks before, and weeks before that, as if history were looping back on itself. Reeves watched the ground vanish beneath them. "Feels like we've been here before," he said. Lasker nodded slowly. "We have. Maybe not us, but someone." The battlefield ahead was silent for now, but the silence itself felt charged. Every hill, every ditch, every scarred tree held the echo of something that had already happened. The men could feel it through the tank's frame, a pulse running through time. By dusk, rain began to fall. The droplets hissed when they touched the hot armor, turning to steam that curled upward like spirits leaving a body. Inside, the air grew humid and heavy. Anton kept the engine low, letting it hum like a lullaby. Mason leaned back and closed his eyes. Reeves wiped condensation from the walls, tracing meaningless patterns with his finger. Lasker stared at the control panel, the worn buttons, the faded paint, the scratches carved by unknown hands. He imagined the men who made them, their laughter, their panic, their last moments. "They're all still here," he thought. Not out there in the mud, not buried under the wrecks, but here, in the bolts, in the steel, in the endless turning of gears. When darkness settled completely, they parked beneath the cover of ruined trees. The rain stopped. Steam rose in ghostly veils from the tank's hull, drifting into the night. The machine cooled, but its memory stayed warm. Somewhere deep in its body, a tiny spark clicked. A relay resetting, a valve closing, a whisper of metal settling into rest. To anyone listening closely, it might have sounded like a sigh. Inside the beast, 4 men slept. Outside, the rain returned, soft and relentless, washing over the scars until they gleamed faintly in the moonlight. The machine dreamed. Dawn never truly came that day. The horizon simply shifted from black to a bruised gray, and the ground steamed as if the earth itself were sweating. The crew had been awake for hours before the first light filtered through the periscope. Inside the tank, the air was already heavy, part smoke, part breath, part the invisible weight of what was coming. Engines rumbled across the valley like distant thunder. Each vibration passed through the treads and into their bones. Orders crackled through the radio, broken words half lost in static, but the meaning was clear enough: advance. They were moving toward the storm. Anton eased the throttle forward, and the beast crawled ahead. Outside, fog wrapped the landscape in a pale shroud. Mason adjusted the sights, scanning for movement. Reeves secured another shell, his hands steady but his jaw tight. Lasker sat back in his command seat, eyes narrow, listening to the sound of 100 machines waking together. It was the sound of an army exhaling. Then came the first flash. A plume of fire erupted in the distance, followed by the concussive thump that seemed to punch the sky itself. Within seconds, the world transformed. Muzzle flashes lit the horizon. Shells screamed overhead, slicing through air thick with dust. The tank shuddered as nearby blasts peppered the armor with shrapnel. The war had resumed its song, and this time it was deafening. "Target at 1 o'clock!" Mason barked. Reeves slammed a shell into the breech. Metal on metal. Lasker gave the nod. Fire! The cannon spat flame. The recoil hammered through the compartment, knocking a wrench from the wall. The smell of burned propellant filled every corner. Mason's eye never left the scope. Missed high, he muttered. Adjusting! Before he could finish, the tank rocked violently. Dirt cascaded from the ceiling. Lights flickered. A hit close, too close. The crew froze for a fraction of a second, counting heartbeats, waiting for the next one. When it didn't come, Lasker's voice cut through the haze. Back to it. We're not done. The next round found its mark. Through the slit, Mason saw the enemy tank bloom into a pillar of orange and black, its turret lifting like a cork blown from a bottle. Cheers erupted on the radio, other crews calling out kills, but inside their own steel shell there was only silence. Victories here were measured in survival, not celebration. Reeves wiped grime from his face. That's 2 for the day, he said, trying to grin. Lasker didn't answer. His gaze stayed forward where the smoke thickened into walls. The terrain turned treacherous. Craters swallowed the path, and Anton wrestled the controls like reins on a wild horse. The treads ground over twisted metal, half-buried helmets, fragments of machines that once roared like theirs. The tank was breathing hard now, engine whining, hydraulics sighing, as though it knew how much more it could take. Temperature's rising, Anton warned. She's running hot. She'll hold, Lasker replied. She always does. Outside, infantry shadows darted between the wrecks, ghosts flickering through curtains of smoke. Some waved them forward, others simply followed the rumble, trusting the steel to clear the way. Every few meters, the cannon barked again, each shot tearing open another pocket of chaos. The radio shrieked suddenly. Distress call, coordinates, a voice fading mid-sentence. Reeves's hands hesitated on the next shell. For a moment, even the machines seemed to listen. Somewhere out there, another crew's luck had just ended. Lasker's jaw tightened. We keep moving! The tank plunged ahead. Fire danced along the horizon, reflecting off their armor like molten sunlight. The heat outside became a living thing, pressing through the hull, seeping into their skin. Sweat ran in streaks down soot-blackened faces. Reeves's hands slipped on the casing. Mason's eyes burned from the fumes. Every breath was a mixture of oil and fear. Then, a direct hit. The world exploded sideways. The interior went dark for an instant. Sparks rained from the panels. The men were thrown against steel walls. A shrill alarm wailed somewhere deep within the belly of the beast. Anton coughed, choking on smoke. Left tread's damaged, he shouted. Can we move? I can try. He slammed the controls. The tank groaned, treads screeching as if protesting the order. Slowly, painfully, it began to turn. Through the cracked periscope, Mason caught sight of another enemy silhouette, closer this time, moving fast. Target closing! 200 meters! Reeves loaded. The shell clanged home. Mason aligned the sight. Ready! Fire! The blast tore through the enemy's flank, igniting its fuel. A blinding flash followed, and then silence, just the ringing in their ears and the faint hiss of steam escaping through bullet holes. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the ticking of cooling metal filled the space. Lasker finally exhaled. Status? Anton wiped his forehead. We're limping, but alive. That'll do, Lasker said. Outside, the smoke began to thin. The valley was littered with shapes, some still burning, others frozen mid-movement. The wind carried the scent of iron and rain. For the first time in hours, sunlight broke through the haze, catching the armor of the surviving tanks like gold leaf. Reeves leaned back, exhausted. Feels like the whole world's on fire. It is, Mason said quietly. Anton nodded toward the horizon. And we're still in it. Lasker looked out through the narrow slit. His eyes reflected the flames beyond, twin embers in the dim cabin. That's war, he murmured. Heat and metal. You burn until there's nothing left to melt. The radio crackled again, orders for regroup. The battle line was moving forward. There would be no rest. The crew straightened, each returning to his station as the engine rumbled back to life. As they advanced through the smoke, the landscape seemed to pulse with residual heat. Every ruined shell, every blackened tree, every crater still shimmered. It was as if the earth itself had absorbed the fury and was now radiating it back, a warning to anyone who dared to forget. Inside the tank, the men said nothing. They had learned long ago that words were useless here. Only motion mattered. Reload, aim, fire, survive. Beyond the armor, the world screamed and burned, but within the beast, there was rhythm again. A terrible, familiar rhythm. The tank rolled on, its shadow stretching across the scorched ground like a scar. And in that moment, amid the thunder and flame, the machine felt alive. Not as a weapon, but as a creature born of every heartbeat, every breath, every desperate will to endure. This was the heat of steel. This was its song. The sky was the color of iron. At dawn, the world seemed to hold its breath. Not in peace, but in anticipation. The clouds were heavy, swollen with smoke from the night's bombardment, hanging low over the charred landscape like a ceiling pressing down on everything that lived. Lasker's tank crawled forward through a graveyard of machines. The earth was scarred black, trees snapped into splinters, and the air smelled of fuel and old blood. Every few meters, the treads clinked over discarded shell casings and crushed helmets. Somewhere in the distance, the dull boom of artillery pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, relentless. Inside, the crew spoke little. Words had become precious like oxygen. Reeves sat hunched near the viewport chewing on a piece of wire, a nervous habit he'd picked up after the last engagement. Mason tapped his foot to the rhythm of the engine, staring into nothing. Anton kept his hands tight on the levers, his eyes fixed forward, as though looking too long at the wreckage would invite the same fate. Lasker broke the silence first. "We've crossed this ground before." Anton frowned. "No, sir. Different sector?" Lasker shook his head slowly. "No, it's the same. The same earth, the same smoke. It all comes back." Outside, a faint drizzle began to fall, smearing soot into black mud. The droplets hissed where they touched the still warm armor. The tank's skin was a patchwork of burn and rust now, like something alive, healing and decaying at once. They reached a ridge where the world opened up, a valley of ruins stretching to the horizon. Hulks of tanks lay half sunk in the mud, their turrets blown open like peeled fruit. Smoke curled from their wounds. Lasker signaled to halt. The machine groaned to a stop, breathing heavy through its vents. The crew climbed out, the air thick with the metallic taste of rain and gunpowder. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that carries weight. Below them lay the remnants of a battle so violent it had erased sound itself. Mason walked to the edge of the ridge and looked down. "How many of us do you think are left?" Lasker didn't answer. He didn't know any more. He lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in the wind, and watched the smoke twist into the same gray that hung over the valley. "Every time we pass through, there's less," he said quietly. "Fewer men, fewer machines, fewer reasons." Reeves chuckled dryly. "But the thunder keeps coming." "Always," Lasker murmured. "Until there's nothing left to echo." They stood there, 4 silhouettes against the wasteland, until the radio snapped to life again. Static and urgency. Orders, coordinates, another push forward. Another name for the same grave. By the time they climbed back inside, the drizzle had turned to rain. Water streaked down the periscope glass, distorting the world into a blur of motion and memory. The engine coughed, then roared back to life, drowning out the sound of the storm. As they descended into the valley, the mud clung to their treads like hands trying to hold them back. The ground sucked greedily at the weight of the machine. It was as if the earth wanted it too. The metal, the men, their ghosts. Halfway through, they passed a familiar wreck, the same tank they had seen months before, now half swallowed by dirt. Its turret had collapsed, but the serial number was still visible beneath the grime. Mason reached out and brushed the side as they passed. "Old friend," he whispered. Suddenly, a distant boom rolled across the sky, followed by another, closer, sharper. The horizon flashed. Lasker reacted instantly, shouting orders. Anton pulled hard on the levers. Reeves loaded the cannon before anyone asked. The rain intensified, turning the valley into a living storm. The first shell landed close. a geyser of mud and shrapnel. The second struck behind them, close enough to shake bolts loose from the inner walls. Inside, everything was chaos and vibration. The air filled with the metallic scream of ricochets. Mason shouted over the noise. "Where's it coming from?" "North Ridge," Lasker barked. "Elevation 200, fire!" The tank's cannon answered with a thunderous roar that split the air. A moment later, silence. Then another flash, another recoil. Smoke filled the cabin. The smell of gunpowder was thick enough to taste. They fired again and again until the gun's heat warped the air itself. When it was over, the rain had become steam. Outside, nothing moved but falling ash. Lasker leaned back, his voice low and hoarse. "Cease fire!" Anton exhaled slowly, his hands trembling on the levers. Mason wiped grime from his face and stared at the smoldering ridge ahead. Reeves laughed softly, a sound somewhere between relief and madness. No one spoke for a while. The thunder had stopped, but its echo lingered in their chests. That deep, hollow vibration that never really leaves. When they finally climbed out, the rain had washed the ash into black rivers running through the valley. The world looked clean again, almost peaceful. But it wasn't. It was only quiet, because everything that could scream had already done so. Lasker walked a few steps ahead, boots sinking in the mud. He looked back at the tank, their home, their curse, their memory made of steel. The rain glistened on its surface like sweat on skin. He placed his hand on the armor. "You held," he whispered. "You always do." The others joined him, standing in the rain. No ceremony, no words, just the sound of water hitting metal. As dusk bled into night, lightning flickered in the distance, a brief flash revealing the valley's scars. Then darkness again. The thunder returned, faint but certain, rolling across the horizon like a promise. Inside the tank, the cooling metal ticked softly, the same rhythm it always did after battle. The same heartbeat. The war would move forward tomorrow. Orders would come. Engines would roar. But for now, for this single soaked and silent hour, the men and the machine simply existed, breathing together in the ashes of thunder. The dawn came slow, a pale gray bleeding over the horizon, struggling to pierce through the haze that hung over the valley. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the world still dripped. Smoke lingered low to the ground, crawling like wounded ghosts through the mud and wire. Lasker hadn't slept. None of them had. The tank sat half sunk in the earth, its armor streaked with soot and rain, its engine cold for the first time in days. Inside, the air was damp and heavy. Mason lay slumped against the wall, half dozing, his face lit by the faint glow of a dying lamp. Reeves cleaned the barrel of his sidearm with trembling hands, his reflection distorted in the metal. Anton sat in silence, staring at the compass on the dashboard that no longer pointed north. Outside, birds had returned, a few thin-voiced creatures that sang from the shattered trees. Their calls sounded alien against the ruin. It was as if the world itself had forgotten what peace was supposed to sound like. Lasker stood at the hatch, watching the horizon. The first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, touching the valley floor with a strange golden warmth. It looked beautiful, but unreal, like light shining on a corpse. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded map, the edges torn and stained. The lines meant nothing now. The world had changed too many times. "Command says the push continues at noon," Reeves muttered, his voice flat. "New coordinates. Another hill, another name for the same place." Lasker didn't look back. "We move when the sun's higher. Let the light find us first." They spent the next hour in silence. The sound of distant engines began to rise. Other tanks, other crews, moving out. The war wasn't finished with them yet, not by a long shot. When they finally started the engine, the tank groaned like something waking from a bad dream. Smoke coughed from the exhaust. The machine rumbled forward, treads cutting through the softened ground. As they rolled toward the next ridge, Lasker noticed something, a glint of metal half buried near a burnt-out crater. He ordered Anton to stop. Stepping down into the mud, he brushed away the soot and debris. It was a piece of armor plating, stamped with a number he recognized. His own. From a tank they had lost months ago, for a long moment he just stared at it. The same serial, the same mark, as if the war itself was looping, swallowing its own dead and spitting them back out. He climbed back in, slower this time. Reeves looked at him. "You all right, Captain?" Lasker nodded once. "We're ghosts, Reeves. Just haven't noticed yet." They continued forward. The valley narrowed into a ravine, steep, dark walls on either side, the sunlight fading into shadow. A perfect trap, Lasker thought, and his instincts tightened. "Keep your eyes up," he said. "We're not alone down here." The words had barely left his mouth before the first shell hit. The explosion tore the air apart, dirt and shrapnel spraying like a wave. The tank rocked violently, alarms screaming inside. Reeves was thrown against the wall. Mason grabbed the mounted gun, shouting through the chaos. "Enemy ahead! North Ridge!" Lasker's commands came fast, automatic. "Anton, push forward! Reeves, load AP! Mason, cover the flank!" The world outside was fire and echo. The tank lurched through the ravine, returning fire. The recoil shook through their bones. The periscope filled with blinding flashes, muzzle bursts from hidden guns above. They fired again. And again. Each shot was a heartbeat, each recoil a jolt of life. The walls of the ravine glowed orange with reflected flame. Smoke filled the interior. Sweat mixed with soot on their faces. Then a direct hit. The blast struck near the rear, slamming Lasker against the console. The engine roared and sputtered, oil spraying from a cracked line. Sparks danced across the metal floor. "Damage to the rear track!" Anton shouted. "Can we move?" "Not far." Lasker gritted his teeth. "Then we hold here." The next minutes were chaos, a blur of noise and impact, light and shadow. Reeves kept firing, his movements fevered and mechanical. Mason's voice cracked through the radio, calling targets, cursing between breaths. Anton fought to keep the engine alive, every lever a prayer. And then, silence. The echoes faded. The enemy guns stopped. Only the ringing in their ears remained. Smoke curled around them like mist. Lasker opened the hatch slowly, gun in hand. The morning light was sharp now, cutting through the haze. The ridge ahead was silent. Their shells had found their mark. The enemy positions were burning, but victory didn't feel like anything. Just exhaustion. He turned back toward the tank, his tank, and for a moment, the scene froze in his mind. Anton at the levers, covered in grease and ash. Reeves sitting against the wall, chest rising too slow. Mason clutching his arm, blood trickling down between his fingers. "Reeves," Lasker said quietly, kneeling beside him. The gunner looked up, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "Did we get them?" "We did." "Good." His hand slipped away. The cabin fell silent. Lasker sat there for a long time, the sound of the engine fading beneath him. Outside, the sun had climbed high enough to pierce the valley fully. The light was blinding. It reflected off the metal hull, off the puddles of water, off the shells and wrecks, everything shining as if the world itself was burning gold. He stepped out into that light. The battlefield around him looked endless, an ocean of steel and smoke stretching beyond sight. The thunder was gone, replaced by the whisper of wind through ruins. Lasker turned back to the tank. It stood there, scarred and silent, its barrel pointing toward the horizon. The last light of morning caught the edges of its armor, making it glow. He placed a hand on it once more, feeling the faint warmth still radiating from within, the last heartbeat of the machine. "Rest now," he whispered. The wind carried his words away, and for the first time, there was real silence. Not the pause between battles, not the heavy breath of survival, but silence. The kind that means something has finally ended. Lasker stood alone in it, the sunlight bright on his face, the echoes fading into memory. The war would roll on somewhere beyond the hills. But here, in this place of fire and ghosts, the last light had fallen, and with it, the last of the thunder. The war ended on a day that didn't feel any different. No fanfare, no clean break, just the absence of sound where it used to thunder. Lasker remembered it vaguely. the message crackling over the radio, the sudden stillness in the air, the disbelief that followed. For a long time, no one moved. The guns stayed loaded, the engines idled, as if everyone feared it might be a cruel trick. But the silence held. Days turned into weeks, and the smoke began to clear. Fields that once bled oil and ash began to show faint traces of green again. The wind carried the smell of wet earth instead of cordite. The sky, for the first time in years, was blue. But for Lasker, peace was just another kind of noise. He still woke to the phantom rumble of engines, the metallic clatter of treads grinding over mud. Every gust of wind sounded like artillery in the distance. In his sleep, he saw Reeves lighting a cigarette, Mason laughing with a bloody grin, Anton cursing at the jammed levers. And always, the machine's heartbeat, echoing somewhere beneath it all. When they disbanded his unit, Lasker didn't go home. He couldn't. Home was a word that didn't fit anymore. He drifted between outposts, staying wherever there was metal and fuel and the smell of grease. He fixed engines that didn't need fixing, stared for hours at rusted tanks half buried in weeds. One afternoon, he found himself walking through what used to be a battlefield, now quiet and unrecognizable. The grass had grown tall, swallowing the bones of machines. Birds nested inside gun barrels. Rainwater collected in shell craters reflecting a calm sky. He stopped beside the wreck of an old tank, its turret cracked open, its hull torn by time. The number on its side was almost gone, faded by rust and weather. But he traced the faint outline with his fingers. It wasn't his, but it could have been. They all looked the same in the end. He sat down beside it and listened. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of wind moving through the empty hull. It was soft, rhythmic, hollow, like breathing. For a moment he closed his eyes and imagined it. The machine alive again, its heart still beating somewhere deep inside. He could almost hear Reeves loading the next round, Mason calling targets, Anton cursing at the smoke leaking through the vents, his own voice echoing in the confined space, shouting orders that never left the steel walls. And then it faded. The sound slipped away, leaving only the wind. He exhaled and opened his eyes. The sun was dipping low, painting the fields gold. The tank's shadow stretched long across the grass, and for an instant it looked like it was still moving, crawling forward toward some unseen horizon. Lasker stood and brushed the dirt from his coat. His knees ached, his hands were scarred with grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He wasn't a soldier anymore. Just a man who'd been inside the belly of something too big to understand. As he started walking again, the sound followed him. Faint, but there. The echo of iron, rolling across the field like distant thunder. He passed through the remnants of a camp, rusted helmets, broken rifles, the skeleton of a watchtower still leaning against the sky. A faded sign lay half buried in mud, the paint barely visible. Forward Command, 1945. He crouched and traced the letters, remembering the chaos, the orders, the endless repetition of advance and retreat. The ghosts weren't gone. They never left. They just changed shape, from men to memories, from machines to echoes. As night fell, Lasker built a small fire beside an overturned transport truck. The flames flickered against the steel, turning the rust into a dull orange glow. He pulled his coat tight and stared into the fire until his eyes blurred. He thought of the crew, of Reeves's shaky laughter, Mason's stubborn grin, Anton's silence. He wondered if somewhere their machine still stood too, half buried in the same soil, their names forgotten but their echoes alive. toward the coast. But tonight he sat among the ghosts of steel and let the echoes sing their final song. The flames flickered once more, caught in a gust of wind, and for an instant the old tank behind him seemed alive again. The glint of firelight tracing its edges, its shape reawakening from the dark. Then the light dimmed, and it was just wreckage once more. Lasker leaned back against the cold armor, closed his eyes, and listened. The world was silent, except for that faint rhythmic sound in the distance. A heartbeat, a memory, the echo of iron. The years passed quietly, though quiet had never meant peace for Lasker. He grew older in a world that had forgotten what war sounded like. The streets now hummed with the gentle rhythm of engines built for comfort, not destruction. The same hum used to signal danger once. Now it meant commerce, routine, the pulse of a civilization eager to move on. Factories that had once forged armor and shells now made cars, radios, toys. The same hands that had built machines of thunder now built machines of leisure. But when Lasker walked past their gates, he could still smell the old smoke beneath the new paint. He lived in a small flat on the edge of the city, overlooking a river that carried the reflection of neon lights instead of tracer fire. His neighbors knew him only as the quiet man on the third floor. Sometimes, when the nights grew too still, they would hear the faint creak of metal and the low hum of something heavy turning in his sleep, the subconscious sound of gears and engines that never left his head. One morning, a letter arrived, stamped with the seal of the National War Memorial. Inside, a formal invitation. Veteran Lasker H. You are cordially invited to the opening of the Armored Division Historical Exhibit. He read it 3 times before setting it down. His hands trembled slightly. That night, he couldn't sleep. He dreamt of the old tank, not as it was at the end, broken and burned, but as it had been the day they first received it. New, gleaming, unstoppable. The crew alive and laughing. The engine's growl a promise instead of a warning. When he woke, he could still feel the vibration under his feet. The next morning, he put on his best coat, one of the few things that still fit him, and made the trip to the Capitol. The museum stood on a hill overlooking the city, its glass walls catching the pale winter sun. The banners outside read, Echoes of Valor, the machines that won the war. He hesitated at the entrance, watching families walk past, children tugging their parents' hands, soldiers in dress uniforms posing for photographs. To them, it was history. To him, it was yesterday. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and paper. The floors gleamed. Behind glass cases sat uniforms, medals, and letters from men who no longer had names. Then he saw it. At the center of the main hall, raised on a low platform, lights tracing its edges, was his tank. The serial number on the side was still visible, the same faint digits he had once traced in mud and blood. The armor had been cleaned, the rust removed. The cannon pointed upward now, as if in salute. A plaque below it read, Restored M4 Unit Number 2473, the Lasker Crew, one of the last operational tanks of the Northern Front, preserved in honor of the men who served within. He approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the hall. The world around him seemed to fade. The chatter of visitors, the murmur of guides, the hum of lights, all dimming into a distant buzz. When he reached the tank, he lifted a trembling hand and touched the cold metal. For a moment he thought he heard something, faint, deep within the armor. A low hum, a breath. It was gone in an instant, but it left him frozen. He rested his palm against the side, feeling the chill seep into his skin. The metal was colder than he remembered. Dead metal, but it still held the memory of warmth, somewhere buried beneath years of dust and silence. He leaned closer, whispering almost to himself. You held. A security guard passed by, offering a polite smile. Beautiful piece of history, isn't it, sir? Lasker nodded, but didn't answer. He didn't need to explain that to him. This wasn't history. This was a heartbeat. He walked around it slowly, tracing each weld, each scar that restoration had tried to erase. The patch along glanced off in the ravine. The dent near the viewport. Reeves's lucky save. The faint burn along the turret edge. The fire Anton had put out with his bare hands. They had polished away the blood, but not the memory. Lasker climbed the short railing and peered inside through the open hatch. The interior was pristine, too pristine. The seats replaced, the controls repainted, the smell of oil and sweat erased. A placard listed the functions of each station. Driver, gunner, loader, commander. He whispered their names under his breath. Anton, Reeves, Mason. Each word felt heavier than the last. For a long time, he stood there, a single man surrounded by the polished ghosts of history. Then, as he turned to leave, he caught sight of something beneath the main display light, a small plaque set apart from the rest. It read simply, "Recovered items from Unit WWII." Inside the glass case were a few objects, a scorched helmet, a dented canteen, a cigarette tin, and a small tin box. His breath caught. It was his box, the same one he had carried all those years ago. Inside, untouched, lay the same fragments, the button, the strip of canvas, and the spent shell casing. The shell was blackened now, the brass dull and worn, but he could still see where the fire had kissed it before it cooled. He reached out instinctively, his fingers pressing against the glass. The air around him felt colder. The sound of the museum seemed to fade again, replaced by the distant rumble of engines, by the metallic rhythm that had lived in his bones for decades. The echo was back. He closed his eyes. In that moment, the polished floor became mud. The faint hum of lights became thunder. The museum walls fell away, and he was there again. The tank roaring, the crew shouting, the horizon burning red. Reeves' voice broke through the noise, laughing even as the shells fell. Mason's hand on his shoulder, Anton cursing at the gears. And over it all, the heartbeat of the machine, steady, alive, eternal. When he opened his eyes again, the room was still. The visitors were gone. Only the faint reflection of the tank shimmered on the glass before him. He straightened slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. His reflection in the glass looked older, smaller, but behind it, the machine stood untouched, immortal. He stepped back one last time and saluted. Not out of ceremony, but out of memory. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing softly through the hall. Outside, the sun was setting. The city below was alive with light and motion, engines humming in the distance, not in battle, but in peace. He stood at the top of the museum steps, watching the glow fade into twilight. The air was cold, but it carried that same low vibration he'd always known. The sound of the world turning, of steel remembering. Lasker smiled faintly. "Still following me," he whispered again. He descended the steps slowly, each one sounding like a note in an old, familiar rhythm. Behind him, through the glass walls, the tank stood under the lights, silent, motionless, eternal. For those who passed by, it was a relic. For him, it was the last living thing he'd ever known. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, a gust of wind swept through the plaza, gentle, hollow, and for just a moment it carried a sound. A deep, mechanical hum, like an engine breathing somewhere beyond time. Lasker paused, turned slightly, and listened. It faded into the night, swallowed by the noise of the living city. He smiled once more, not with joy, but with understanding. The thunder was gone. But the echo, the true echo, would never die.